Isma, come si vede? Ah, cavolo. Lo menciono, però sì. Move a little bit. Move more. You're fine up to there.
Okay. But here it works, right?
Here you're in the middle.
Okay, good, good.
And go to the right if you want. No, to the right you're not going to go.
I won't.
Okay, here you're fine. You have a quite a score.
Podemos correr la mesa.
No, sí, corramos la mesa. No, take it.
Okay.
Bueno, para el agua. ¿Esta de quién es? ¿De Juan Carlos? Bueno, esto que no lo toque nadie. Y el agua, si querés ponerla acá. Este es para
No, va, toma así directamente.
esto maneja la computadora, así que no lo toque. Si no, pongo allá.
Ok. Tiene el puntero. Ok.
Bueno, lo quedo acá cerca por la que nadie lo toque. Bueno.
75 minutes, right? Okay, you like 10 minutes before.
Let's wait 1 more minute. Usually we start at 10 past. Bueno, empecemos. Bueno, empezamos. Lo voy a presentar en castellano porque hablo español, ¿no? Un poco. Bueno, tenemos el placer, gran placer de tenerlo visitándonos a Peter Egger. Peter es un economista muy reconocido. Al menos yo lo conozco principalmente por su trabajo en el área de comercio internacional, inversión extranjera directa, pero ha trabajado en muchas otras áreas también, en organización industrial, temas fiscales, ¿no? Y bueno, y eso, él ha venido toda la semana, acá estaba pasando unos días en Buenos Aires y bueno, tenemos el placer de tenerlos con nosotros. Muchas gracias, Peter, por visitarnos.
Thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for the invitation and for being able to present here. I hope this is loud enough for online. So, I would like to present a paper that is joint work with two colleagues from Zurich. My former student, she's now at Düsseldorf, Katharina, and Davide, who is also a co-author of Gianmarco Ottaviano's, and spent 6 years with me in Zurich. It is a paper about uncertainty, and clearly uncertainty is something that all of us know is important these days, right? I mean, some presidents of some countries create it for us every day. And the question is, what is the cost of that? Not because uncertainty, sometimes destroys value immediately, some firms exit, etc., but also it is a cost because people dislike it. We think of many people at least being risk averse, so a more risky environment means a loss of future value or a loss of present discounted value. And the question is, how does that affect us? Not only because we are worse off, well, if everybody's worse off, we're just worse off, and if the world is scaled down by a factor, who cares? But what this paper is about is actually there being heterogeneity of a loss of value due to uncertainty across places. And you will see that this may lead to perhaps a different notion in equilibrium models. So Priscilla is interested in general equilibrium models, right? I mean, if we want to know, if we want to quantify in a multi-region, where a region can be a country, can be literally a subnational region. A region can be a complex combination between jobs and regions, right? How these are affected differently, this is basically the question of this paper and how to model those. So starting point is we have a ton of results in international economics where people talk about liberalization or deliberalization, quantifying gains from trade. And typically we tell students in classroom that liberalizing is good, right? Contrary to, again, what some presidents think. Liberalizing is good, it generates value, it increases consumption value. What we tend to sometimes forget about is to say on average, because in an economy on average, of course, there's different factors, and some factor owners might lose when others might win, but also there is owners of the same type of factor that sometimes might lose and win, and that makes the situation a bit more complicated. Remember this famous paper by Otto, Dorn, and Hansen, who tried to quantify the loss of jobs, basically, or of destruction of job opportunities in the United States across different places or commuting zones in their case, where we already saw that, you know, a break-in of one country into one's market, or of a bunch of countries into one's market, might destroy jobs, and to a heterogeneous degree, depending on who is more and less exposed. So, but on average, we'd say liberalization is not only one way, it's typically two ways. So when we participate in trade agreements, when we participate in the WTO, it's not only that we lower our guard, but also others lower their guards vis-a-vis our suppliers and companies. So on average, we'd say it's a win. And acknowledging that huge variability across people, across factor owners, when recent research documents that this variability can be actually quite large. Right? I mean, the losses that some face is a manifold of the average gains, and the wins that some face is a manifold of the average wins. Right? I mean, remember, there is this documentation of the United States where the average college graduate over the past couple of decades may not participated much actually in the gains from trade of the United States, but the top per mil of the income distribution, these people have just taken off like a rock. Now, there is work particularly looking at this, and Rafael Diz-Canero had a number of papers showing that the reason why there is perhaps not participation in the gains, or even there are losses for some people from liberalization, may be that people don't make use of the opportunities, right? And there could be various reasons for that. So depending on which kinds of assumptions that you make, I mean, for instance, capital being together with labor and producing output, is capital perfectly mobile between activities or not, or is it locked in a place? If it's immobile, it aggregates actually the chances that people lose. And if it's perfectly mobile, it's still the case that some people may take a long time until they may realize gains due to taking up opportunities. So with capital mobility, about 9 years. Without capital mobility, basically a lifetime in earnings, 30 years, I'd say. So there is a big stickiness of people being trapped in situations and not taking up opportunities. And so that leads to a slow adjustment towards a new equilibrium, and basically being trapped in bad situations. And not the only reason for that, but perhaps that is related to the fact that we see across many countries some opposition against liberalization. So one reason for why we see this trappedness, this stickiness, that some people are in places where they shouldn't be. If they would be perfectly mobile like a butterfly, they should immediately go to better paying jobs. Why don't they? Uncertainty may be one reason for that. And the simple rationale behind that is that you might be in a place that is bad, but you are afraid that it could still be worse when going to another place. So this keeps you from taking up potentially beneficial opportunities. If you're God and know that how you will do in different situations, you always move, right? Perhaps we won't have stable marriages in that kind of world. But on the other hand, you know, we might do worse in the alternative situation. So that is well documented in a macro literature. Nick Bloom was probably one of the first to mention that. So an uncertainty may be situation and lead to quite significant drops in macroeconomic measures of, say, welfare. Real GDP around 2.5%. There were other people talking not only about GDP but also output. You know, that's the real output side and consumption. So a final point is there's even heterogeneity of people of different ages. Why is that? Well, you might think of, and that will be an element in our paper here as well, you might think of when you're young, of course, you have a lot of time when feeling the pain of torture, right? When you're old, there's few years left, right? So that's a good thing for being old. When you're whipped, right, it won't last so long, but when you're young, you will have a whole future of being tortured. Now, when it takes some cost to get out of that bad situation, that is a cost, right? As an old, you're weighing these costs versus being in pain, and it might lead to the situation that are young, because you know you can integrate over a long horizon of being well off in a new situation. You might say, okay, I'm gonna write off these one-time costs of moving to a better place. It's a cost, but you know, I still have enough time to make a win afterwards. When you're old, that might not be the case, right? Getting retrained at an age of 60 is too costly and will not have to return on investment when you're 30. It's a different story. Okay? So, just to give you another picture of why uncertainty is something for real, let's look at the specialists. Here, texts from Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? They every year basically publish how different types of jobs, according to their forecasts, should prevail in the foreseeable future. Let's put ourselves into the shoes of a worker, say in the textile sector, at the beginning of the 80s. So you first, you know, get trained and then you start your job in that sector. In the early 80s, the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasted that this kind of job in the textile sector will see a growth in demand by 3.7% for the next decade plus or so. Right? When putting ourselves into the shoes of the same person that now had started working at the beginning of the 90s, this is when China started to enter that market. The prediction was a fall of 20%. Now you're stuck already in this textile sector, and wait another 10 years, it's still a bad forecast of 2% loss. So you're over the hump of the worst, but still it's not a positive forecast. So you see, I would say, I mean, these people at the BLS, they employ specialists, right? I mean, they talk to people, they know the details, probably more than you do when you're in some middle school training and think about which job to take, right? I would say these people know better about the forecast of jobs, but even they erred quite a bit, right? So even the specialists don't do well, and when I'm going across the hall and talk to people who do business forecasts, right? I mean, it's damn hard to, in times like this one, to forecast the next 6 months, not to talk about a year. You can imagine when making decisions about things that are very sticky, like getting trained for a job, which program to enroll in at the university, these are hard decisions to make. They have strong implications for your future. At a time when, you know, not much is known, right? People now talk about AI, right? And even AI CEOs tell us that we should guard ourselves. We have no clue, we economists, they say, we have no clue what's going to come in the next couple of years. We might lose 20, 30% of jobs, right? I mean, which ones, where, what shall I do? Okay, so what do we want to do? What's the research question? We want to relate to a literature that basically does quantitative simulation kind of work, right? What we do when we study typically things like what's the effect of liberalization if a country enters Mercosur or whatever, what's the economic benefits of that? Most of what people do there are, these days, models that have some input-output structure, multi-sector, multi-countries, right? We basically set up our equilibrium model, we press the button, and then we get some endogenous adjustment of wages, prices, the ratio of the two being welfare or real consumption, right? This is what we do. Well, we point-in-time equilibrium framework that will not be anything novel that we can talk about in this paper. So the big emphasis is going to be on one. So we relate to a dynamic literature, right? And again, there is now a number of dynamic models over the past 10 years that had multi-region, could be countries, it could be subnational regions, multi-region general equilibrium models where they ask the question, what dynamically did trade liberalization or did technological progress do to the allocation of people? Because people at a subnational level, more so than at the national level, are mobile between countries. Even though, you know, here we are in Argentina, we've seen big influxes in different historical episodes of people from various places. I mean, almost everybody I met in Argentina is somehow dual citizen of Italy. Sorry, I mean, and I'm from Austria. I shouldn't speak up here because in Austria, I mean, there's a big melting pot from the monarchy, right, of people from surrounding Central and Eastern Europe. So there is, even at the national level, Switzerland has like 30% of the residents being born abroad and having a foreign background. So if you go to small countries, there is a lot of mobility across national borders. But of course, if you zoom into countries, then there is even more mobility between regions. So that's a literature we want to relate to, and in particular, Rafael Ixcanero, Artuch, and McLaren had papers on this regard. So John and Erhan had papers before that with different other co-authors, etc. in AER and elsewhere, and Travell and Dave Donaldson had a paper where they looked at dynamic models. So Trav and Dave in the US, Rafael, Brazil, Artuch McLaren in the US as well, where they basically asked the question, well, if we change something, people are forward-looking, right? They factor in what might happen in the future. How is that going to affect their choices today? How can they choose? What's their policy? Well, they can move, right? They can escape a bad situation, right? So that's the main building block that we're going to relate to. And what we will do in that regard here is, I think, fundamentally different to what the rest of the literature, or most of the literature does, because everybody is basically doing models that are approximately linearized in the steady state with a continuum approach where you basically have marginal changes around the steady state and then look at how adjustments will work out in that economy, and we will take that to discrete. And discrete is a hell of an animal, is a really bad beast here, because, you know, we have the problem of an infinite state space. So if tomorrow something happens here and there and everybody's drawing from some risk distribution, the realizations across different places are infinite, right? So I have an infinite state space problem that dynamically I have to figure out when talking about in 100 periods down the road, if already at any moment in time there's infinitely many shocks happening, possible shocks happening, because we only can measure the variance of risk, right? When infinitely many things can happen in one place and then across many different places, how can we solve that forward-looking dynamically, right? So that's basically exactly the thing that we want to do here. And why do we want to do that at all? Well, we think if you're in a spatial economy where places are discretely different, right? So La Plata and Buenos Aires, as close as they may be, they are discretely different things. And this is already not talking about Mendoza and Buenos Aires, right? Which are geographically also far apart. I mean, you might on the one hand make the case, well, the lattice is a continuum, yes, but how we measure people is in discrete administrations. They are discretely different, and sectors are also not rankable in a way. They are also discretely different. I mean, they have different technology parameters, they have different rules by which they work. We want to go to something that's really discrete and not make the world a continuum of everything, because that's not how we measure it. And if you go down to the computer and try to simulate things, you will always have to make some question here, some discreteness assumptions how to simulate. The question is, how do you do that? In particular, also because, you know, many people in the literature, I will show you in a second, but also us, we might be interested in doing really big shocks, right? And when we talk about climate change, flooding, when we talk about like big shocks, I mean, Trump the other day talked about 500% on something. I don't know, I mean, this is like a gigantic shock, right? This is not an infinitesimal perturbation of the status quo and the status quo. The question is, are we in a steady state? Most people would claim no. Right? So if we do really, really big shocks that put us away from the basin of attraction from a steady state, at least we cannot solidly claim that we're in the vicinity of a steady state, how can we treat this in a dynamic forward-looking framework? So this is the big question. So what we will do is we will set up such a framework and we will prove certain properties which are very convenient. For instance, we're going to have contraction mapping properties that we can prove for what we're doing, which is not a given, right? Because imagine even with perfect foresight, when you are simulating a model, I don't know, of 100 periods where people have perfect foresight, it's not the same as doing a static framework every period one after the other. You have to simulate the whole sequence of 100 years. This is perfect foresight. But if you have imperfect foresight and risk aversion, this is basically to date, I think, impossible to do with discreteness. So this is where we want to come in. So what we will do then, once we have set up the model, of which I will show you properties, we want to calibrate it, and we want to do somewhat of an unusual counterfactual analysis in the sense that most of what we see in the trade literature is some liberalization scenarios, or deliberalization. We move to autarky and compare the situation of autarky to nowadays. Or we do discrete changes in tariffs, like there have been people looking at the Trump tariffs in Trump 1, and I'm sure there is plenty of people doing Trump 2 right now. Right? So these are discrete changes, and now we simulate how real incomes, etc., are going to change, and how the allocation of people across jobs are going to change, etc. We want to do something different. We want to say, okay, let's keep all the parameters that we usually change fixed. Right? And now do just one thing, shut off uncertainty. Because we want to quantify the role of uncertainty alone. All else equal, right? We want to let the economy run in a forecasted way and just compare agents, how they would behave without the uncertainty and with. And of course, needless to say, you can now take this to another situation and with uncertainty versus without uncertainty, do a trade cost change. We just didn't want to mix those up because I would like to isolate what the bite of uncertainty is in this paper. And what we're going to do is we're going to calibrate that model to jobs in France, and you will see in a second that jobs are going to be triple index things of regions, sectors, occupations. What I call occupation is really going to be skills. Right? So there's going to be just two. But anyway, I mean, you can make it more. But this is already going to be a high-dimensional animal, as you will see. So we will calibrate it to that, and then let the economy run forward and shut uncertainty off. And what we'll see is that there is a big change in welfare changes between -1 and plus 1.5. I call that big. I call it big because Lorenzo and co-authors had this paper where we looked at the China shock on US labor markets, and that's similar to the China shock, even though we don't change any trade costs here. This is just the uncertainty alone. Nothing else. We didn't change any parameters. So this is of similar magnitude to the numbers that we're used to. But I should also say, this is not the big beef here. The big beef lies in the movement of people, and there we see, some jobs lose 37%, others lose 8%. I mean, this is like big changes in the allocation of people across different jobs. When I said job was region, sector, occupation. And the heterogeneity of these effects depends on age. As said before, we're going to do, if you like, a really condensed, you might say Mickey Mouse version of an overlapping generations model. There's going to be 2 age classes here, if you like, 4, but really 2 relevant ones, the young and the old. We're going to lump them into 2 groups. You could make an overlapping generations model with a full-fledged age structure that just leads to a lot of zeros, and we didn't like that in what we want to talk about. You can imagine if in every age bracket you now can move between all the regions and all the sectors and all the occupations, there's going to be a lot of stairs, and you don't see the mobility as well anymore. And so this is the background of what we want to do. Okay, so what do we relate to? Clearly there is tons of work that have to do with what we are doing. There is these static quantitative models. Most closely we relate to Eaton Quorum, the multi-sector input-output version of which is Caliendo Paro. Dekle, Eaton Quorum with the treatment of trade imbalances, many other people. Redding and Rossi Hansberg have an overview of these models. Then there is dynamic models under perfect foresight. This is the Artuch et al. Paper in AER. Artuch McLaren have a JE paper that John is very fond of. It's actually a good paper. It tells you the details of how to interpret mobility flow equations and how to estimate structurally parameters from mobility costs to some of the preference parameters in these models. Then there is Desmet, Nagli, Rossi, Hansberg, who have a dynamic model of the dynamics of geography in JP. Caliendo and co-authors looked at the US. Alan Donaldson looked at the US. Vix Canero and co-authors at Brazil. So perfect foresight here. Then there is dynamic models under imperfect foresight. And these are of two kinds. So some of the people here, Raphael's paper is about lack of macroeconomic uncertainty. So the uncertainty there is people, individual, idiosyncratic uncertainty is everywhere. So you have here somebody who thinks the world is going to be like that. Here somebody it's like this. That integrates out basically. What we're interested in is actually macro uncertainty. The fact that there is a cluster risk of certain jobs. Right? I mean, AI tells us this. There will be certain types of jobs, the AI people tell us we won't need anymore. Machines are going to do it, right? I mean, if you read at what some of these people tell you, in AI companies, 30% of the code is now written by machines. Yeah, I've been on the tenure committee of my universities where people were awarded tenure because they are famous for writing code that writes code, right? So it's basically the computer programming on its own, and it can be very lean on what to tell it what to do. I mean, and some of you might have tested ChatGPT and other AI software in trying to do a code of a problem. Some people tell me, Christian Wolpe the other day told me that they were working on a model and they told AI to come up with a model and proofs, etc. And he said it was remarkable, not perfect, but you know, wait 3 years. Right? Machines might write models about problems that we put in text in their general frameworks. So Raphael has a paper that doesn't have macroeconomic risk, where the risk is not a job-specific thing that affects everybody in these jobs. That's a hard thing because that affects the macroeconomy. Right? It makes big masses of people to move around. If me alone has an impact, well, this is just, you know, I like some cookie better than another, and I'm moving, but I'm atomistic. It doesn't matter. Kleiman et al. And Fan et al. Have other papers. They basically approximate around a deterministic path. Think about it this way. In the Fan et al. Paper, where Fernando is involved in that too, they basically say, okay, suppose we can make up a deterministic perfect foresight path, and we can characterize the uncertainty economy as something that is a perturbation around that perfect foresight path. Right? But that always requires that you're not too far away. So this is basically what the literature here does. It's not basically linearization around the steady state, but linearization around the perfect foresight path. Right? These are the options that people have. And then apart from that, so this is from the trade literature basically, there is of course a macroeconomic literature where people are worried about how do people reshuffle their assets. Right? This is in so-called Hank models, heterogeneous agent New Keynesian models, where people are interested in, you know, if I can invest my assets in a portfolio, how will I restructure my portfolio in the presence of some shocks? There is a big literature with solution methods in these papers there. So Adrien Bilal is the one that is most closely related to the trade literature, does methods but not in the macro, but related to the macro, using the same techniques, perturbation around the steady state. Okay. So here's the status quo of what you find if you screen this literature in trade and the methods papers included, what do? You state the problem in continuous time, so every second you can readjust, and by it being in continuous time, the options that you have are also continuous. So everything is infinitesimally close, not like Mendoza and Buenos Aires, or metal industry versus textiles industry job. Compute the steady state of the model, linearize around the steady state, and compute finite difference approximation that's linearizing around the steady state, assuming, and here I literally don't care whether you give me first order, second order, third order approximation around the steady state, because no matter what you do, if the functional is not right, then you are far away from the steady state, that will not help you. But that's what's done, right? Typically, linearization, sometimes second order, second order as well. This leads to very nice analytic treatments sometimes that are super elegant. So I will give that to that literature. This is enjoyable to read, and it gives good insights. Then use projection methods to reduce the dimensionality. As said, you get the analytics. Sometimes you have analytical solutions in Adrian's work for shocks around the steady state with uncertainty. And then solve for impulse responses with different techniques. Eigenvalue decomposition of the linearized model. This is Kleinman and Redding and others. Master equation, mean field game. So this is the trigger word. Mean field game is a relatively novel, not super novel, but the mean field game literature is relatively novel in math, and Adrien uses it to have the master equation, which incorporates basically the Bellman equation, right? What is the average doing in terms of the value? How's the value evolving over time? And how is the allocation of people coupled with that value evolving? And the last one, perturbation around the deterministic path. This is fun. So, contrary to that, what are we doing? We state the problem in discreteness, discrete space and time. So jobs are unrankable. Is not ordered. I mean, how do you order chemicals versus textiles? Right? On a lattice, you can go marginally east, marginally west, but how do you do that with sectors? I wouldn't know. So in discrete space and time, compute, very importantly, a finite difference approximation of the full nonlinear model. And that difference approximation rests actually on a piecewise linearization. This is not linearization around the steady state. Think of it this way. If you have a nonlinear probability distribution function, right, how do you integrate that normally, unless it has like a functional form that we know, a Gaussian or whatever. But already if you have a high-dimensional Gaussian, how do you integrate that on a computer? Right? Well, you put a mesh on it, right? And you piecewise, what you see in MATLAB or any other mathematical software, when you plot for yourself a surface that's nonlinear, you will see that mesh there, right? It's exactly within that mesh, there are tiles that are basically based on local linear approximation of the function, but of course, if I make that mesh very narrow, I get a super fine approximation of the true thing. That's what we're doing. Right? We are not linearizing the function around the steady state. We are approximating the whole nonlinear thing with a grid. Compute the finite difference approximation of that. Write the model as a coupled mean field game where we have forward-looking value. Right? My value today depends on the value tomorrow, and backward-looking mobility equations where basically where I am tomorrow depends on where I was today. Right? So write that in a coupled way, and do the piecewise linear interpolation of the master equation. So it relates to mean field games, but it's an entirely different, very tiny literature in math about discrete mean field games. So we basically know one paper and a half that exists in this literature. Okay. So here's the model in a nutshell. Time is discrete with little t, and the next that comes is in boldface the job. Right? The job we notate by J. And the J basically has three ingredients: regions, sectors, occupation. Right? So the tuple of these three we call a job. And when I say occupation, I told you before, I mean high skill, low skill. In this particular paper, you can do it differently, right? I mean, if you have very good occupation data, you can go to, you know, if somebody is a tool maker or whatever, or an assistant using the computer, that's not really important. You might say, okay, if I allow people to move here, it basically means I allow them to get an upgrade in their skill. Right? So somebody might get training and then become a tertiary educated person from originally secondary educated. Right? But importantly, the job has these three ingredients: the R for the region, the S for the sector, and the K for the occupation. And then there is competitive firms. And very importantly, these firms are only anchored in two of these three dimensions. Because as a firm, I offer all the occupations, or many of those. Right? I offer all of them, but where I am is really in the sector and the region. Right? A firm doesn't offer just one occupation. Right? They offer several. So that's the important thing. Because later on, where I will anchor my uncertainty, it will be important that the uncertainty varies at a different level from the job, not conceptually, but in our measurement. Right? So we will, as you will see, uncertainty we will basically put on TFP forecasts. Right? I mean, some jobs get bad shocks, others get good shocks, and these shocks will be region sector specific and affect all the firms in these regions and sectors. Right? But the jobs, you know, will differ by another dimension additionally, which is the occupation. So firms are heat and cooling firms, right? So apologies to Juan Carlos. So no quality here, no imperfect competition, whatever, no investment. Firms are really dumb things. They sit there, they draw from a lottery, they make it or don't make it, boom, right? That's it. They face iceberg costs, so these regions and sectors, they're going to be segregated, right? You will be able to produce in a region and sector and sell to any other region. Consumers and other firms are going to buy your output and use it for production or for consumption, subject to trade costs in the very standard way. Labor markets are also segregated. They are local competitive, so workers are going to get one wage within the same job, right? So within the same job, every firm offers the same wage. And remember, jobs are skill-specific, region-specific. And productivity has the same indexation structure as where firms are, right? Region sector, and it varies by time, because there will be an evolution of productivity, and we want to know, of course, which sectors are going to gain in productivity and which are not, because we want to select the right job in the outset, but also move at the right time to the right job as there is shocks coming on the economy. And to this extent, that's not new, right? I mean, Caniendo and co-authors, they have this productivity shock for the US that they measure across jobs, etc. So this is not the novel part. So aggregate uncertainties about realizations of sector-specific, region-specific TAP. Okay. So households, what can they do? What's their policy? Households can choose a job. They can change it, right? They sit somewhere now, and you will see we will make people being born somewhere. And basically we follow Trevel and Dave Donaldson in that, I mean, parents lay an egg, right? They have kids, and the kid is where the parents are. Where they work at a given moment in time is arguably young people, because we only distinguish between the young and the old. So they will have a certain fertility, will have children in these places, and that's all you inherit, right? But it gives you an initial condition as a worker when you're born. And then you can choose, of course, the policies. Will I stay? Will I go? Well, we know that when you're a doctor, the likelihood that your child will be a doctor as well is higher than on average in the population, when you're a lawyer as well, etc. So there is something that makes you anchored, that makes you makes your initial condition informative of where you start out from, but you can move whenever you have a chance. Now, the H, we make a four-prong thing here. The B indicates you're born, and when you're born, you don't consume, right? The only thing thing that you have as a newborn is a location that you earn, a location in the future, right? Because the future is, do I stay in that job where I'm born into, that basically I inherit from my parents, or do I move, and when moving job, I can move to another profession in the same region, I can move to the same profession in another region, I can get high skilled, I can get low skilled, whatever. Right? These are the choices that I have. That's the newborn. The young has a future for them staying young. Remember, I'm aggregating, right? I'm making people of 20, 21, 23, 24, etc. years old. I'm making them all young. So at some probability or at some fraction of the population of young will stay young. Another fraction will transit to being old. And once you're old, you can stay old or you die. And the dead are basically just there to make the total population ergodic, in the sense that, you know, we don't want to talk about population growth here. You could, right? But we abstract from that. We keep the population constant. So the only thing that will happen is reallocation of people. You could extend that model, of course, to one where you have fertility choice, etc. That's an interesting direction to go into when we think about it. But right now we're abstracting from it. Now, with these different age brackets, we have transition probabilities, if you like, we call lambda. So the lambda tells you what will make you transit to the next higher stage. Well, when you are born, you will, at probability 1, become young. When you are young, you will, at some probability between 0 and 1, stay young. That depends on the data, right? Whatever we observe, and we want to keep the population constant, so there will be a certain fraction of the young population that stays young, a certain fraction that transits to old, and whoever is old has a certain probability of dying, and we will, of course, connect the lambda star to the newborn probability to make sure that the population stays constant. But remember, the lambdas tell you how to move up in age.
So the household is just one person?
No.
And the newborn?
I guess, okay.
And the newborn is just born and then decides where to go?
Yes, so I should be precise. Actually, a household is just a person.
It's just a person?
It's just a person, yes. It's a person
and
here.
And then that person decides where the newborn is born?
No, actually, we think of, unlike many of us, we think of these people as super selfish. They don't care about their kids. As I said, I mean, they are like chicken, right? They lay an egg, and then the egg is on its own, right? So, yes, you could have dynastic utilities. You could think of, you know, if you're an American, you're super excited about moving to the right place, or if you're in China, you think about, you know, where do I want to get my hukou, which is the local registration permit, to make sure that my children have access to all these higher education institutions that you can only get into when you have a certain registration. This is absent from this model. You could integrate, but this, you know, first we have to settle the grounds for what we want to talk about, because there is right now nothing that can help you with, even in that simplistic framework, solving that dynamic problem. But we abstract from a lot here. And please interrupt me anytime you have questions. It's more fun. Yes. Okay, good. So now, idiosyncratic stuff. So most of the literature talking about uncertainty has elements of individual uncertainty and risk. But these individual uncertainties and risks are what I call epsilon here, idiosyncratic. So everybody has it, but you know, things are going to integrate out, because there is so many people. Basically, we need this to make sure that there is people really in bad jobs too, because otherwise, if everything was deterministic, why would people stay in bad situations? And even under perfect foresight, you need this, right, to make sure that there is somebody everywhere.
Peter, at each point in time, this economy is just a H-R-N economy, right?
But it's a Ricardian economy in a sense.
H-R-N, but there are different skills, and there is, each sector has a different intensity of use of jobs or skills.
To that end, yes. Yes.
Plus the Ricardian part, the stochastic part.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In that sense, yes. Yeah. And you know, the total amount of skills doesn't change either because of our assumptions that we make. So, yeah. Okay. So epsilon is what you see in many people's work, right? I mean, Artuch, McLaren, in Esteban's paper in JP, it usually is from a gamble because people look for the best thing that they can imagine, right? I mean, when you have the nicest paying job, around that you have the preference parameter, which has a location parameter and some dispersion around it, like you know from the Frechet distribution as well. Changing jobs is costly, so we make some assumptions here that are really not critical. But we're going to say that newborn households have a mobility cost that we put to be larger than zero, actually. So there is moving out of where you are has some cost. It's definitely not negative. And then moving costs are not decreasing in age. It's not critical that we assume that. The only thing why we want to do that is if you change that ordering, that mobility costs would decrease with age, right? It would overturn some of the mechanics that I was talking about before. Imagine, I said before, if my value of the future is smaller, conditional on everything else when I'm old, but my moving costs are lower than when I'm young, it will go contrary to my argument that the future value of something good is lesser for somebody older, right? It wouldn't do harm to the model. I just don't want that to be there to supersede the basic mechanics for us to see it. Actually, later, I'm going to make these costs actually to be identical across the age groups.
So the last two,
Yes?
you pay a cost regardless of whether you move inside your region or outside your region. It's just if it's a different job, it's a different triplet.
So it's really triplet pair specific, right? And it could be, I could make it such that if I stay in the same region or if I stay in the same sector, these costs are different from moving region and sector. I could make that, right? This right now is still a black box, like with trade costs. With trade costs also, I mean, we have these ad valorem costs, but later we need to fill them with content and say how do observable variables map into those. I haven't made any statement about it right now, but we will see how we parameterize those. Okay, so here comes the beef. This is now for one particular person, right? The value function for one particular person depends basically on two ingredients. The contemporaneous value of a job and the future. Right? The contemporaneous value of a job is I'm earning an income and conditional on where I am, I'm spending that income on consumption there that depends not only on my income but also on prices. Yes, please.
So you're assuming that everyone is employed?
Yes. Okay, I could allow for there being a job which is unemployment, and then I would have to say what is the today's value of unemployment could be a fraction of real consumption, or some fixed unemployment benefit that's region specific or that's nation specific, whatever. I don't have that right now. But it would be simple to
One
include.
question, is the Bellman equation.
Yes? Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Sí.
That's a Bellman equation. Right. For the individual. Right?
Individual.
That's the individual
Yeah.
Bellman equation, if you like. The Bellman equation actually uses the aggregate. But here's just the individual. And every individual, so what you see is here that the present value, not the present discounted, but the present value of where I am right now is not indexed by individual, right? Because it's the same for everybody in that job, right? No matter of whether young or old, everybody earns the same income and everybody has the same consumer price in a job that's anchored in a region. So the price index in that place is going to be the same for everybody. Homothetic preferences, everybody consumes the things as we have in our Caliendo Paro kind of models. Okay? So nothing really interesting about the U here. It only has an age index to make sure that we don't let the young, the newborn consume, right? And we don't let the dead consume, right? So this comes natural. Now, here, what the individual is going to do about the future, it's going to look at the best paying things. So it's not comparing all the different jobs that there are and going to the best place, but unlike in perfect forecast models, it will not go to the best paying, actually best paying job tomorrow. but there is an individual risk and there is a macro risk, as you will later see, as well. So there is an individual risk. You have this Gumbel shock, and you might refuse going to a good paying job because you just like dishwashing, right? And that's what keeps you there. Today you get this value, and the new here is just this preference parameter from the dispersion from the Gumbel distribution of these shocks. What's important is the zeta here are these mobility costs that I had before, and it's key that these are not time indexed. It would be really impossible to solve that problem if you had time indexed mobility costs, because then things explode into the future. So these are time invariant, like they are in all the literature that I know, but they are job pair specific and eventually age specific as well. And now there is the present discounted value. Here you have the expectation. Beta is a discount parameter. The expectation about the future, where you weigh in every period 2 events. The chance that you move to the next higher age bracket and have a specific value for that, because the future shrinks if you're old, right? And the probability of staying times the value of your current age bracket. Okay? So, but other than that,
Sorry.
yes?
Integrative state is changing the preferences of tomorrow, so?
No, right now this is only today, and tomorrow I get another one. And every period I get a time-specific thing, individual time-specific, which will have a constant dispersion rate across time. The mean will, of course, be anchored in the value, as you will see in 1 second when I show you the mobility equation.
Peter, I'm confused about something.
Pardon?
I'm confused about
Yes.
something.
Yes.
You are not fired here. It's just that, right? Because you don't have the risk of being fired. You always face some return to your job specific triplet. And so in some sense it's automatically the general equilibrium solved, the equilibrium wages are set, and this is what you see, and you never get like, right?
I mean, I think I understand what you mean. I mean, in the sense that here all the policy is on the worker, right? The worker chooses of where to go. In that sense, you might say it's voluntary job dissolution. On the other hand, it's also true that when you, as a company in a region and sector, get a bad productivity shock, you will see lowered demand towards your output, and that will lower your demand for all the factors too. Right?
That's what I'm saying. All the equilibrium is solved. That's why you see the lower return to factor, because implicitly all the equilibrium was solved again without nobody being fired. It's like an auctioneer has already solved the whole thing, and you see that the return to your job goes down.
That is true in this. I mean, there is we later calibrated to France. There is a France-wide full employment constraint right now because we don't have that sector that is unemployment, which we could have. So you could have people moving into unemployment. That would not be problematic per se. It would be an additional factor in the generation of the wage in every period, but it would still be part of the intratemporal wage determination equilibrium. So, I mean, if you had like something like fair wage constraints or search and matching, you could put that into the intratemporal equilibrium, and we don't right now.
No, that's what, because I was thinking about what Andres asked. If you model this, you could even have an employment as a transition stage where you choose to wait. Like it depends on how you set the transition cost.
Absolutely, and the unemployment benefit. Absolutely, you could have that. Yes. Right. Okay. Now let's move from the individual to the average. Right. So in every job and age group, so I need to make sure that we only integrate within the integrable things, right? It's job and age group specific things, because remember, when I'm old, I have different future than when I'm young, etc. So age group, job specific thing is, everybody is the same here, right? This is representative, right? Before in the region what is right now, everybody earns their wage in the same job, even irrespective of the age except for the newborns. And then now we have 2 expectations. One is the expectation across the households, right? It's cross-sectional if you like. and one is the expectation across time, which is the temporal. So there is nothing changed in this regard, so we had that already before. But that thing will change, and here we will have the Gumbel functional integration later on that will have its location and dispersion parameter with the nu, etc. Okay. So that's the Bellman equation, right? as usually find out at the individual, but the average. Now, three ingredients, right? The Bellman equation tells us about the evolution of the value as a function of future events and future expected values. The policy tells us what are people gonna do, and the Kolmogorov equation basically tells us where do we see people actually allocating in aggregate, right? So what's the policy? Well, this is basically Artuch, McLaren, JIE, right? They talk about continuum, but in any case, there's no difference here. You'll see that you have this value of the job. So basically, this is talking about moving at an age of A from a job J to a job N, right? And that job N has this future value, right? This is just the value of that job with the probabilistic weights of staying or becoming older in the age group. Mobility costs, this is different, this is very Gumbel specific, different from what we have in our usual trade models where you have the trade share. So if you look at Eaton Quorum or Caliendo-Powell, you have something analogous, functionally analogous to that. You have basically the price that a firm offers in a particular market relative to the aggregate of these prices in that market gives you the share of the probability basically of making it, of being the most successful in that market, depending on the Frachet dispersion parameter. This looks very similar, but one big difference and important interpretation is that these mobility costs are not like ad valorem. They're measured in value terms of the job. So this is going to be $1 or whatever, in whichever currency. You measure the expected value of a job measured in that currency. But it's negative, of course. And the 1 over nu is that dispersion in the Gumbel distribution. And what do you compare this value to? Well, with all the other options that you have, right? And all these other options involve mobility costs. Of course, if you stay in the same job, there will be no cost, a particular value attached to that, etc. Right? So that gives you the basically probability that somebody at an age A from region J will move to job N, depending on that job's value relative to all the other options that a person has. That's the policy.
Sorry.
Yes?
You're considering here some possible coordination problem, because I was thinking about people trying to go to the same job, or it's
Yes.
just that the price system solves
Yes.
everything.
So that,
problems.
yes. So what you're, I mean, okay, two pronged answer.
Right.
On the one hand, there is in a way some telltales coordination because the expected value is going to be the same for everybody in the same age group and job they come from, right? And it will also be in telltales correlated with the value of that job from other places, because what that value is will be the same for everybody except for the mobility cost of going there. Right? So in that sense, there is correlation of that. There could be deterministic correlation between mobility costs. If you're from two neighboring regions and going to the same sector in another region, the correlation between these costs will be high, but that's deterministic. And there is one last thing, so these two first things are there, but there is one last thing that's not there, which would be that the Gumbel shocks are correlated between people, right? I mean, that would be like a multivariate Gumbel. It would be more hellish. I'm not saying impossible, but more difficult to integrate. I mean, Natalia Raimondo and Nelson Lind have this paper on correlated Frachet shocks, for instance, so I guess one could go somewhere in this regard as well. But, you know, I don't want to overemphasize the idiosyncratic thing here, because everybody is atomistic, and these idiosyncratic shocks, we want them to integrate out and focus on really the aggregate shocks, the aggregate uncertainty rather than the individual one. Okay, so if we take that policy together with where xt, we get where they will be in t plus 1, right? Because what will happen to the young in t plus 1? Well, the young in t plus 1 can be originally in the state of being newborn. With the lambda star parameter, they will move on, or they stay young, and both of them have these transition probabilities of these probabilistic things of telling us how they will allocate the policy, right? So if I'm summing that over all the places, meaning jobs, where people can come from, I'm getting where people are next period. For each age bracket separately, because the young and the old are going to behave differently because of these lambdas and the policies being different for them.
One question.
Yes?
The person, the worker,
Yeah.
solve the Bellman equation.
Yes.
Then see the distribution of the
Yes.
Kolmogorov in the situation in the aggregate.
Yes.
So modify the resolution of the Bellman equation, and the resolution of the Bellman equation affects the Kolmogorov.
Sure, and so that's exactly the complication. This is why this thing is so hairy. I mean, the Bellman equation is coupled with the Kolmogorov equation, because what the future value is going to be depends, of course, on how many people will be there, right? If everybody is going to move to a job that's attractive today, you know, in industrial organization, we have this literature on the pork meat cycles, right? Where farmers look at pork prices in a day, and if pork prices are high, everybody is going to build stables and farm a lot of pigs, and boom, 10 months later, the price collapses. So we have these cycles. And that's exactly a problem that can happen there too. It's very fundamental that the future value depends on the L, and that I now, as an individual, when thinking about the future, I have to forecast, of course, what the other people are going to do and where they're going to land, because that is material for, in every future period, there is this intertemporal equilibrium being solved, where the wage is going to be determined, that's sector, region specific, that's job specific, and that will affect the V, and that makes it so complicated, right?
You know, the pork, I know it as a spider web model.
Yeah.
No?
No, but there's an investment cycle model in IO in the 80s or 70s, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, but yes, that's the problem.
Here is the cutting.
Yes, yes. Okay, so equilibrium. What is equilibrium? Well, there is a predetermined distribution of labor, so labor sits somewhere, allocated across the jobs. There is a current realization of region sector TFP. So TFP gets in every period shocks, right? It's risky. Let's say there is Z many realizations that this has. I'm saying Z many because we're going to have a distribution of those. And that distribution, as you would integrate any probability density function numerically on a computer, we're going to put a mesh on, right? And we're going to integrate that whole thing. Within period, so you might say this is the aggregate stochastic and this is an aggregate deterministic shock, so where people are ending up. Within period, equilibrium is just caliendo power. Nothing interesting to say here. Wages and all the other factor prices are going to be determined within equilibrium statically. And then the dynamic equilibrium is we have to solve these Bellman equations and the Kolmogorov equations simultaneously. And we have two H groups, big J jobs, and the big Z comes in here because the big Z we're going to make use of in discretizing all these events. And you might say you're crazy, right? Because there's infinitely many possibilities. How many people, I mean, I'm moving one person from A to B, and then I'm moving another one from C to D, etc. This is infinite state space, right? This is exactly the problem. So let's see how we do that. Okay, so the model dimensionality is relatively big but finite, right? These are regions as sectors. J, which is RSK, many jobs. We have an endogenous aggregate state. This is the LT, right? This is endogenous because it depends on the value that people foresee in moving to places. We have an aggregate stochastic state. This is basically the productivity shocks, the distribution of productivity shocks that may occur. So you might say, in every job at any moment in time, I have a distribution of the people that might be there depending on the shocks that there are, right? I mean, this is a distribution of J many kinds, right? And they are interdependent too, right? Because I mean, the population has to aggregate up across all the jobs. And the intertemporal equilibrium I don't want to talk about. Okay. So, solution algorithm. Now here it gets interesting because so far we're in a place where we would say, okay, that state space is infinite and we close the book, right? I mean, what has the literature done in that? Well, as said before, continuous time, but that's not what we want to do. Krusell-Smith comes to mind. What did they do? Well, they said, let me put up a concrete specific function, and rather than work with the infinitely many actual possible realizations that can happen, let me move from these realizations to the functional form and work with moments of the function. That's not what we are going to do, right? Because we don't want to impose any functional form here about the TFP shocks or whatever. We want to say, okay, this is some non-parametric function out there that has some distribution that stays, but from that distribution we draw and we have to integrate it. And we cannot replace the function itself with its moments. That's very important. So, what we're going to do, we're going to have a finite state approximation of the system of mean field games by basically moving from the actual infinitely many possible distributions of people to P points. And when I say points, it's really P vectors, right? Because what I want to do is, I want to say, okay, across all these jobs, we have right now an observed distribution of people. So that's a fraction of people in every job, right? I'm going to put P many such distributions, right? That gives us in every job P different possible realizations. If you think about the distribution of the people in that job, I can linearly interpolate between those, and now have a parameterized distribution. Now, this is not one job, it's of course J many, so I have this P times J function, which is basically a mesh on the infinitely many possible realizations of the distribution of people in all these places. This is very, very important, right? This is a trick. And that trick will move us from infinite state space to finite many approximation points, which we linearly interpolate to go back to infinite, but we can integrate. Right? This is a very, very important. I mean, our mathematicians at my university tell me this was a smart move. Right? So this allows us basically to prove contraction mapping. Only that, because you can imagine right now I can say, okay, for all the possible realizations, I can the whole future integrate any moment in time easily, right? Because there's at any moment in time, people can just, the people are fixed, and they can reallocate in these interpolated ways. I can integrate for the whole future, right? And I can now search in this integrated distribution of people, the things that are consistent with the Bellman equation, right? And find the equilibrium in that, and establish contraction mapping about that discrete mean field game. Okay, so contraction mapping is about the P times Q system rather than the original infinite state space system, based on piecewise interpolation, where we have barycentric weights which have certain properties and which are elemental for proving properties.
The original state continues. Then
Say again?
Then transform the continuous space, discretization.
Yes.
Yes.
So basically the productivity distribution is continuous.
Yes.
I put a mesh on it to interpolate points.
And then continue for
But of course there's infinitely many points still, right? It's just that I can integrate that function because like when you do, I don't know, Gauss-Hermite quadrature about the bivariate normal function in econometrics, for instance, when you have a bivariate normal problem, that's how you integrate, right? With a meshed problem.
The first continues, then discrete, and then interpolation continues.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So uncertainty trap that we know already from Bloom. How many minutes do I have? 15. Okay. We know already from Bloom, right? People are trapped in bad places. Why? Well, because they're fearing it could be worse. Right? Double dividend from moving for the young, where you basically feel twice the pain when you live twice as long. And on the other hand, with mobility costs, you might escape and it still pays off. And what may be an interesting bit for the trade economists relative when we talk to macro people, right? In macro people, they would say uncertainty is bad. Here you would say, well, uncertainty absolutely has no value. Right? I mean, it has a value, but in terms of mobility, it can still be better to be in a less uncertain place than in a more uncertain place. So uncertainty absolutely doesn't tell me anything about the mobility of people. So in a sense, relative uncertainty can be a comparative disadvantage rather than an absolute. Simulation stylized model. Let me strip everything from that model and walk you through a 3-region world where one region is a lame, rest of the world that's just there to settle prices through goods. 2 regions that we focus on, 1 and 2, and we're gonna look at them first. Symmetric uncertainty, and then I make the uncertainty asymmetric for 1 age group, and then I'm going to move you to 2 age groups to see where the differences occur. So this is just some calibration. This is how we're going to model TFP. Basically, we're going to have an autoregressive process where you have some mean, so that's the forecaster predicting TFP that's there, but that makes an error, and that error has some distribution, right? That's how we measure basically the risk, the uncertainty of a particular job. There is a deviation accumulated over time about a certain job where some jobs see bigger and smaller fluctuations, etc. So we calibrate that. We have an autoregressive parameter about this too. We have symmetric uncertainty, perfect foresight, low uncertainty, high uncertainty. Then we have asymmetric uncertainty, where one of the regions is going to have a higher scaled sigma term than the other, and high makes it bigger, the difference between the two. Okay. Tauchen method, what did Tauchen do? Well, Tauchen said, give me some stochastic distribution that may be impossible, that is impossible to numerically integrate unless you put a histogram on it. Right? And now the question is, how many bars do we want to have? Right? That's basically Tauchen. What we find is that we cover the distribution of shocks well with this method. We let the realizations of TFP be constant over time and just have this uncertainty about it. And of course, in the perfect foresight, initially the population is allocated 50-50 between the 2 regions of interest. They may not move out of this world to the rest of the world, but stay there. Okay? So here's 50-50, symmetric uncertainty case. Nothing changes with uncertainty relative to the certainty, because, well, if everybody is uncertain, yes, you dislike uncertainty, yes, and the more uncertain it is, the less you like it, but it doesn't make you move because the neighboring region is as uncertain as this one. If it's asymmetrically uncertain, so region 1 has higher uncertainty level than region 2, what you will see is that people move out of region 1, the more so, the more uncertain region 1 is. People dislike uncertainty, right? They move away, it's like a cost, it's like a reduction in their wage in that region. And that's just the value here. That's the share of population in that region, so it declines from 50.
What are the lines?
Yeah, this is the share of population in region 1. And what you see is here, time periods. So it takes time until people move, right? Because there's a dynamic equilibrium, but higher uncertainty means more people will move out in steady state. With lower uncertainty, less people will not move out, and that's the value of these jobs, of these regions, basically, for people.
More uncertainty, people move out more.
Yes? Yes. More uncertainty in region 1 relative to region 2. More people will avoid region 1, escape the high uncertainty of region 1.
Okay, there is.
Pardon?
Okay, there is. Okay, there is the uncertainty.
Yes?
Because you're starting in a no uncertainty.
I'm starting symmetric, perfect foresight equilibrium, and now I'm hitting people with uncertainty with more in region 1. That means it's like a bigger reduction in the wage in region 1. Right?
Sorry, perhaps I got lost in the presentation, but now in this calibration you are only analyzing moving between regions. But
And the value.
the people who moves, they keep their jobs, they go to the same sector, so you are allowing people.
Yes. Here is a super stylized economy. The only job attribute is region.
Okay.
Right? Just this is not a calibration of a real world. This is just to go to the bare bones of the mechanism here. Right? The only thing you can do is you can escape the region with the high uncertainty. And you do, to a larger degree, the more uncertain it is. So here's young versus old, and what you see is the young are more mobile than the old. That makes sense because the old are short-lived. Right? And you see also that the old are facing actually a lower reduction in value because they don't live long enough for the pain to take the full effect, if you like. Right? So this is basically just what I said before in illustration. Now, counterfactual analysis for France. We have 2,156 jobs. This is 22 regions. This is basically the département in France. 49 sectors, 2 skill types. Right? You might say this is very coarse, and to one extent I agree. But we also need to understand if I can make this as fine-grained as you like. The thing is, you will have many things, many cells that are empty. Because if I go to, I don't know, cities and 200 sectors, there will be many cities that don't produce in these sectors. And then there will be no movements between these sectors. So you inflate, it's like in trade, right? When you do very, very fine-grained sector and region accounts, you will flood the model with zeros. And I didn't want to do that for this project because my beef is about something else. But just to be clear, that will happen when you go very fine-grained.
Just to understand,
Yes.
if preferences were linear, you didn't have a concave utility, you weren't risk averse, would you have this behavior now? Uncertainty wouldn't mind. To understand
We have risk aversion. A risk aversion you need to have.
You need to have
Yes.
risk aversion.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so these are the jobs, of course. That squared are the cells of them, and you can imagine this is a huge transition matrix already. It's 2,000 squared cell pairs that you have. So the individual stochastic state is age groups, young and old. It's stochastic because, you know, we aggregate in the way I said. And we have aggregate stochastic state, 5 basically points that we put on the mesh for the shocks on the productivity distribution. We have the Bellman equations, the Kolmogorov equations. Kolmogorov the 2,000 squared because you can move between all pairs of jobs. And the Bellman equation twice that number because you have today and tomorrow, right? And again, the 5 points depending on the integration of the Tauchen stochastic productivity. Now, production, we have occupation share, sector occupation share, labor share, so the total wage cost share, the occupation specific wage cost share, the intermediate share, that's pairwise, that's coming from the input-output table of France. We compute trade costs in the usual way, symmetric, Heavenly's, estimate TFP, estimate the stochastic process, basically that's the distribution of the error term of TFP, moving costs, control for endogenous evolution of deterministic state, and counterfactuals. Caliendo Paro, so if you know, this involves many things, I mean all these factors and the TFP, how can you basically, so what we want to have is the TFP level. So in a nutshell, imagine the following. In a market clear, in a goods market clearing equation, we're used to, in general equilibrium models, right, in CGE models, for instance, we're used to change some parameters, say trade costs, and solve the value of sales as a function of the total of demand, put the structure of the model, put all the exogenous factors in, change the GDP to a new value, and solve for the counterfactual wage cost, right, or counterfactual prices. That's how you use general equilibrium accounting basically to solve for counterfactual values of things that you don't know. Right? Now here we're basically inverting that problem. We say, okay, in the status quo, in any period of the status quo, in my pre-simulation period, I can solve the market clearing conditions given the factor prices that I observe for those periods for the TFP up to a numeraire. Right? That's just inverting the problem in a sense that that's what this says. So I can back out from sales and trade flow equations, given factor prices, I can back out the TFP that's consistent with those values for, say, a 15-year period, and now take those as data. That's what I'm doing. Now, if I have these data, I can basically postulate the same autoregressive model as I had before. You could say, okay, now I'm an incrementrician, I want to forecast TFP. Let me do that by estimating that autoregressive process and get the moments of the residual, that's the unpredicted, in a sense, error term. So I have these moments here from the series that are per se not interesting. I mean, what's interesting is we, of course, have a positive autoregressive parameter, 0.5, right? It's not shocking, I would say. And now I'm doing two things. I'm saying, okay, what about everybody takes their uncertainty from the same stochastic distribution of all the residuals, that's what I call symmetric uncertainty. Uncertainty is the same everywhere, versus I make it asymmetric. I'm saying, okay, I'm learning my distribution from this local job about the 15 years of predicted data that makes the sigma squared job specific. I'm doing these two things, I'm putting these nodes, these are the 5 Tauchen points of the distribution about which I'm integrating. Okay. So here you see the long run TFP, manufacturing services. We know that manufacturing is rather in the south of France. Services is more important in the north. Moving costs, you know, I see from the people that are in a particular job and move between jobs. I'm doing 2 pairs of consecutive years. I'm learning these moving costs and model them as a function of distance. Are you staying in the same region? Are you staying in the same job? Are you staying in the same skill group, and some interactions of those, right? So yes, there is job pair specific costs. It's not the same as staying in textiles versus moving to chemicals, etc. So this is parameterized. And after doing that, when we simulate the model, we get an overall fraction of stairs that in the data is 98%, in the model is 96%, so we slightly underpredict stairs, slightly overpredict mobility, but we have a good pattern between the old and the young. The old stay more likely than the young. That's exactly consistent with what we said unconditionally in the data and in the predicted model. Moving costs, where is it hard to move out from? It's just some variation across places. Then we calibrate the model to make sure that the population stays constant, that the fraction of young and the fraction of old in the model is as we observe them in the data. And then look at employment. In 2012, letting the model run forward in the steady state. So you see some regions like Bourgogne, they lose in manufacturing, but gain in services, etc. That's me going there to buy wine, etc. Now simulation of the uncertainty shock. Okay, we keep the realization of TFP shocks constant from the last year of simulation onwards, flat, right? But there is uncertainty. We let the model run into a steady state, and the procedure here wouldn't even require there being a steady state, but we do it because it's easier to compare. We have risk aversion log utility. So here are the simulated effects. This is symmetric uncertainty. This is the mobility of people, and this is the value. So here are 0.1%, 0.25%. This is 10% movers. This is 4%. So you see more action in moving than in value. So the relative valuation changes between jobs create action in people's moving according to the model. This is only because of uncertainty. Comparing with and without uncertainty. So with uncertainty, people move away from places.
But this uncertainty is symmetric. What does it mean?
It's the same. We take the error distribution, have the same distribution about all the residuals, and assume that this is the uncertainty in every job. Identical across the job.
Why do people move?
Well, people would even move with a perfect forecast economy here because they're starting out in some equilibrium that is not optimal for them. So they will reallocate until the economy settles. Right? So that's what but we compare that settle point, that the point where they settle, where the equilibrium happens, with and without uncertainty. And
Just to see and to understand, in a steady state, there are gross movements of people, but not net movements.
Yes, exactly. It's
Okay,
ergodic.
so my
The
question
steady
was-
state is
okay.
ergodic.
And this is the net, the gross, not the net.
This is the allocation, the average allocation of people in the steady state with uncertainty and without. And what I'm saying is, with uncertainty, there's a 5% to almost minus 10% difference of people being in a job relative to the perfect forecast. So there is a big difference due to uncertainty alone in the allocation of people across jobs in the steady state.
One question, I don't understand its theoretical subset. The interpolation is theoretical. The interpolation
Yeah.
is for the necessity of continuous for a fixed point for the equilibrium, no? The interpolation in your model is necessary for apply the fixed point.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, okay, you have to get from infinite state space to something that's finite, even though we still have an infinite state space, but it's interpolated between finitely many points. Okay. So here is when I learned the variance of the shocks from across jobs, and you see this is really big. So you see that there's more than 100% difference in some jobs in terms of the people that are there, and there is bigger variation in the value as well. So uncertainty, that's my claim, uncertainty itself is a big economic factor and cost. Not necessarily disadvantages. So some people gain from there being uncertain because uncertainty may be bigger in other places, and the relative value of some jobs increases for that. Right? This is why I said it's a comparative advantage. And particularly the action is big in the middle income jobs. So the difference in old full-time equivalents moving to better jobs is 23,000. In young employees, it's more than 1 million. And the percentage total workforce population is 4.11%, reshuffling due to uncertainty alone. And this is the highest paying versus lowest paying job. So you see, this is a fraction of the population, so 7%, 9% of the total population in the workforce. I don't talk about robustness, but in a nutshell, what we do is we have this problem of uncertainty in discrete state space is an infinite state space problem, and we couldn't do any simulation work on this, even though when you want to solve problems on a computer, you always have to discretize the problem, so something is needed here. And I think we propose a method here that relies on linear approximation of continuous probability functions, high dimensional when you have many jobs, because people allocate across all these jobs, so this is a high dimensional problem. But it gives you properties that we can handle mathematically, proving fixed point and contraction mapping.